It's not as though the pro-life movement is trying to force women to parent. When a woman is pregnant, she is already a parent, right?
Hmm.
The only choice we do not agree with, that we do not think should be a legal option, is the choice to kill.
Well, hey everybody, my name is Sean Hussey. This is Cold Brews and Catholic Truths. I'm really excited for today's episode. This is a very important episode. A lot of what I've been doing in this podcast over the past couple of years, of course, is focusing on Catholic apologetics, especially in relation to our Protestant brothers and sisters and kind of the dialogue that occurs there. In light of the recent Supreme Court decision, I thought it would be very important to have an episode about the evil of abortion. And so I have a fantastic guest joining me today, Mary Carmen, and she is going to help us respond to some common arguments that pro-choice advocates typically make in favor of abortion. Especially in response to this Supreme Court decision, there has been an added attention to this conversation. And I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing that there's, again, conversation around the question of abortion. And this can be an opportunity for us as Catholics, if you're listening, if you're a Catholic, to more boldly engage in dialogue about the grave evil of abortion. And as you do so, you might encounter objections to the point that you make about the sanctity of human life, of the preborn human life. And so this episode is going to be an opportunity for Mary Carmen to help us respond to some common objections. Specifically, we're going to focus on two common, really prevalent objections that I hear all the time in this conversation. So we'll get to those in just a moment. But before we do, I just want to introduce Mary Carmen. It's great to have you with me, Mary Carmen. So good to see you. If you don't mind, why don't you just take a moment to just introduce yourself and share with the listeners and those watching a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. It's an honor to be on your podcast. I am the Indiana Regional Coordinator with Students for Life of America. So if you have never heard of Students for Life, it is the largest, most active youth pro-life organization in the entire country of the United States. So we have activated about 1,300 student pro-life groups. So these are student-driven, anywhere from middle school all the way up to law school. And together we recruit and we train and we mobilize the pro-life generation to abolish abortion in our lifetime. So that's what I do. I'm based in Indianapolis, and I help all of our students just have the confidence and the compassion to talk about abortion on their campuses.
So in the work that you do, Mary Carmen, I'm sure it sounds like you have these kinds of conversations a lot.
Yeah, yep. So whether it's online, whether it is social media, whether it's in person or just speaking at a church, this is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And I really think that this particular issue of abortion determines how we view everything. I think it determines our view of God. I think it determines our view of suffering and whether there is any merit to suffering or sacrifice. And so this kind of shapes our worldview. And I think it's important that we have the tools to be able to reason and just have discussions about this and not kind of hush it under the rug as it has been for so long.
Yes. Well, a lot of people, in light of the Supreme Court decision, are responding to this decision from like a political perspective, and specifically addressing whether or not there's a constitutional right to an abortion. And I certainly don't think that there is. But in this episode, I really want to focus on, is there a moral right to an abortion? Because whether or not we lived in a country in which there was a constitutional right to an abortion, even if there was, I still think we ought to be opposed to it, because this is a grave evil, morally speaking, whether or not the country that we live in allows for this. And so what I'd like to do then is just to bring up some common objections maybe to the pro-life position. And there's a lot of them, and a lot of them maybe aren't that strong. I'm picking these two because I've heard at least the strongest articulations from the pro-choice side in favor of abortion with these two arguments, and also just because they are the most common. I tend to come across these arguments or variation of these arguments the most. And so before we get into those two arguments, why don't you just take a second, Mary Carmen, to maybe share with us a little bit about, to summarize the pro-life position, or to summarize your position. What is abortion, and why is it evil? Why is it wrong?
Yeah. So anytime we're talking about this issue, language is really important. We want to make sure that our definitions are clear and precise and that we're not talking apples and oranges with those we're speaking with. So when I define abortion, when I discuss abortion, I refer to abortion as the direct and intentional killing of an innocent living human being prior to his or her birth. Okay, so those two words, direct and intentional, we're very clear and specific. We're not referring to ectopic pregnancy treatment. We're not referring to septic uterine treatment or miscarriage removal, right? We are talking about the elective decision to intentionally and directly end the life of another human being prior to his or her birth for the purpose of producing a dead child and having the woman be unpregnant. So that is the definition of abortion. There are about four different procedures, four different kinds of abortions in the United States. So the most common, the first trimester abortions are either chemical abortion or sometimes referred to as medication abortion. I don't use the term medication abortion just because the purpose of medicine is designed to heal, right? Not to kill. Aspiration suction abortion. Okay, those are also in the first trimester. And then finally, dismemberment abortions, which are those D&E abortions. And then what we would call heart attack abortions are those late-term third trimester abortion, where they're inducing the chemical digoxin into the heart of the preborn child to cause a cardiac arrest and deliver a dead child. So those are the kinds of abortions we're referring to. And why is it wrong? Abortion is wrong for the same reason that any other act of violence that is directed and intended to kill an innocent human being is wrong. And so we take this stance of equal rights, right? Every living human being deserves the equal right to life, the equal right to be protected free from violence. And abortion is a form of direct intentional violence against children.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's helpful to know that information, and it was helpful to even walk through the brutality of the abortion procedure. I think what's clear, and even describing some of the ways in which abortion occurs, is that this is not healthcare. As you said, this is the opposite of medicine. It's certainly not medicinal. I mean, from a Catholic perspective, I see this as like some of the best work of the devil. That somehow he's been able to convince a large portion of our society, a large portion of our country, that the direct and intentional killing of our children, of mothers killing their own children, is somehow disguised as healthcare, a healthcare that we ought to have a right to. And I think in your description of what abortion really is, the type of abortion we're talking about, and also even what goes into an abortion at any point throughout the pregnancy, how horrific it really is, and how nobody in their right mind could really describe that as healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's again super important. We have that at the focus of our mind. Every abortion intentionally does one of those four things. Every abortion either starves or suctions, dismembers, or poisons, all forcibly, an innocent child to death. We cannot forget that. We cannot stray from that truth of what we're talking about when we look to abortion.
So let's get into a couple arguments that we often hear from pro-choice advocates in favor of abortion. Of course, the language is that people have a right to have an abortion, that people have a right to an abortion. And so with that comes some arguments for why people have a right to have an abortion. And so in this episode, I would love, Mary Carmen, for you to help us respond to maybe two common objections that I've been hearing recently in favor of abortion. And I think are arguments in favor of abortion, I should say. And I think these two are closely linked to one another, and they build upon each other. So I'll do my best to ask them as questions and or formulate them as arguments. My hope is certainly not to straw man the position, but I'm going to do my best to articulate the best versions of these arguments that I've heard. And Mary Carmen, you can help us maybe respond to them. So
Sure.
The first one is an argument from viability. And this argument essentially says that it is permissible to terminate a pregnancy before the point of viability, wherever you would define that, let's say 21 weeks, because the fetus cannot survive by itself outside of the womb. And so because the fetus can't survive by itself outside of the womb, there's some implications there that I can get into, but the initial articulation of the argument would just be that prior to the point of viability, there's nothing wrong with terminating that pregnancy, because it's not a human life that can survive outside of the womb.
Yeah. So I really asked the question, what is viability exactly? If you define viability as being able to survive on one's own, well, there are many people, many human beings whose bodies cannot survive on their own, whose bodies are dependent on either medical technology, on other people, right? Even if a woman gave birth to a 22-week-old baby who is, quote, viable and can survive on his or her own, that baby can only survive on his or her own so long as the parent is actively providing nutrients and care to that child. So when we're discussing terms like viability, or someone who is completely independent or whose body is autonomous and can function properly, does that mean that bodies who are dependent on other people or other medical technology for survival are justified in being terminated or killed after birth? I would think not. So it's not that, I think there's this faulty assumption that we don't become human, or we don't become a valuable human until we have the capability of surviving on our own. Our argument, whether somebody is dependent on another being, on their parent, or on medicine, or anything of that nature, that doesn't change the fact that they're still a human being, right? And our argument is that human beings, dependent or independent, deserve protection, deserve freedom from intentional acts of violence. And so viable babies, viable toddlers, whatever that looks like, they still, whether they're dependent or not, they do not have the right to be killed by another individual. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Maybe just to keep pushing it, though, isn't there something different about a preborn fetus, the dependency that they have, and other types of dependency for born people? A preborn person has a certain kind of dependency that only that one person can provide. Only the mother is able to provide for that fetus, and so you're forcing this one person to take the responsibility of taking care of this fetus as it develops. Whereas other types of dependency for born people, anybody is able to provide those types of service, or the things that a person would need after they're born to sustain their life. Where the dependency that a preborn child needs is really solely fixed on that one person. In other words, the kind of dependency they need is like beyond just like, or it is body function, where the dependency that maybe born people need, the dependency that a child, an infant would need, or that an elderly person might need, or somebody with extreme disabilities might need, they're still like their body is able to function autonomously. They don't need somebody necessarily to be like breathing for them, or providing the nutrients in that kind of way. So lots of different people can provide the resources somebody would need. So I guess just to summarize, isn't there something different though about the viability or the lack of viability that an early fetus has than other types of dependency?
Yeah, so you're correct in the sense that the dependency created between the preborn human being and the intimate form of relationship of dependency that two human beings can have, right? As you said, this preborn human being is solely dependent on one person, but it's important to remember that the things that this preborn human being derives from the mother are basic nutrients, and a proper location, a proper environment for survival. So the the human being inside of the womb is on a self-directed path to maturity, right?
Hmm.
Everything that human being needs to survive is within itself. The only thing, just like every other human being, that this preborn human needs is nutrients in a proper location, a proper environment that only the womb can provide, right?
Hmm.
And so sometimes when we hear these arguments, and as you even mentioned this word, how can you force this sole provider, this woman, to be the one that is responsible? It's not as though the pro-life movement is trying to force women to parent. When a woman is pregnant, she is already a parent, right?
Hmm.
The only choice we do not agree with, that we do not think should be a legal option, is the choice to kill. So
Hmm.
it's different than, we think of the uterus as an organ, right? It's different than a mere organ donation or an
Hmm.
organ transplant. Okay, if I was somebody in need of a kidney donation, right? And it just so happened that you had the kidney that would be able to save my life. There's three hypothetical situations. Okay, you could either help me by donating my kidney. You could either not help me by not donating your kidney,
Hmm.
or you could kill me, right?
Hmm.
But we don't recognize killing as a legal option. Now, not every situation has these three options. Sometimes there are only two. So, in the situation of pregnancy, for example, you can either, the woman can either help the child by carrying this child for 9 months, or she can choose to actively kill this child. Okay.
Hmm.
And we do not recognize actively killing through the form of abortion as a legal option. Um, I think it's important that we're honest about the dishonest term of force, right?
Hmm.
Just because an option is not available to you doesn't mean I'm forcing you to do the other option. The only right that pro-lifers do not advocate for is this legal right to kill. And it is a very intimate relationship. This child is inside of the woman,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean the woman doesn't have bodily autonomy, right? Every single human being has bodily autonomy. And so I know we'll talk
Yeah.
about that later on and what that looks like. But
Hmm.
I hope that was able to provide more
That
insight.
was. No, that was really helpful. I'm hearing a couple things too, like two things that stood out to me at least, or one is like, um, what is essentially, it's hard to say, it's hard to determine what is essentially different about a human being before they're born at any point in the stage of gestation and a human being after they're born. And what I'm hearing you saying is that there's no essential difference. There's differences in characteristics and points of development, but there's no essential difference to their nature and their dignity as a person, as a human being. And the other, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say it's actually a famous quote is that there's no philosophical difference between the adult you are now and the embryo you once were that would justify killing you,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, I had a couple of quotes that I was hoping to read off. I think, at the very beginning of this conversation, before we even talk justified in this circumstance, or what about this circumstance,
Hmm.
the first question we have to ask, even before we ask what is abortion, is what are the preborn, right? We
Hmm.
have to define what
Yes.
something is before we can determine what we can do with it.
Hmm.
And so that needs to be at the forefront of our minds. What are the preborn? When does human life begin?
Hmm.
Because if the preborn is a living human being, well, even if a woman had the right, a sovereign zone over her body and anything inside of it, does our bodily rights allow us to harm, violate, or kill other bodies, other living
Hmm.
human beings? And
Hmm.
obviously, no.
Yes.
Um, and so, if there's a time, I'd like to read off a couple of those quotes that talk about when life begins.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, go ahead and do that.
Sure. So, this is actually from the American College of Pediatricians. Um, Pretty simple. It says that the predominance of human biological research confirms that human life begins at conception, fertilization. At fertilization, the human being emerges as a whole, genetically distinct, individuated, zygotic living human organism, a member of the species Homo sapiens, needing only the proper environment in order to grow and develop. The difference between the individual in its adult stage and in its zygotic stage is one of form, not nature.
Hmm.
This statement focuses on the scientific evidence of when an individual human life begins. Again, that's from the American College of Pediatricians.
Hmm.
They went on further to state, quote, "It is clear that from the time of cell fusion, the embryo consists of elements from both maternal and paternal origin, which function interdependently in a coordinated manner to carry on the function of the development of the human organism. From this definition, the single-celled embryo is not just a cell, but an organism, a living being, a human being." And so
Hmm.
from the moment of conception, you have this new, unique, genetically distinct human being, right? And yes, that human being is dependent on his or her mother
Hmm.
for survival, for the proper environment. Um, just because there is this intimate relationship in which a child is dependent on his or her parent in the way in which all human beings are reproduced does not justify the use of violence, particularly killing, right, that child for being dependent. That's the only way in which human beings can be
Hmm.
brought into this world.
Right. Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing. Those are really interesting quotes. I mean, it obviously emphasizes the point that the fact that life begins at conception is not a belief. It's not like a religious belief or a religious idea, but this is a scientific
Right.
fact. So it's not your or my belief that human life begins at the moment of conception. It's just the reality. It's a fact that is when a separate person. We didn't come from embryos. We were embryos. I mean, at this,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. It's not that we develop into a human being by simply getting older or bigger, right? That's not how biology works. It's not how science works. Whatever organism we are now, we had to be then.
Okay.
And so if we are a living human being now, we had to be a living human being from the beginning. And
Hmm.
my argument, the simplicity of the pro life stance, is that it is wrong, it is morally wrong to intentionally and directly kill an innocent living human being,
Hmm.
right? Born or preborn.
Right.
That is why in every situation abortion is wrong.
So the question then of viability starts to become kind of an insignificant one because, um, as you said, the more important question is what is the preborn? What is the preborn? Because if you know the nature of the preborn as human beings, then viability becomes irrelevant. Rats have viability. But rats are not human beings, so therefore they don't have the same kind of dignity of life that a
Right.
human being has. So, a viable, so to speak, rat doesn't have more worth or dignity than a preborn baby, than a preborn child,
Right.
regardless of the function or the development of that particular child in the womb.
Because the problem from viability is that you and your subjective view get to determine who matters and who doesn't, right? Who gets protection and who doesn't. And I think that's a slippery slope to walk upon. Just because somebody is, and really the term viability in the realm of abortion was a complete political term introduced for the Roe
Hmm.
v. Wade case. But, you know, when you start determining, when you start looking at other living human beings like an embryo, like an embryonic human being or a fetal human being, and you say, well, sure, it is a biological life. Sure, it is biologically a human being. But that doesn't matter because it doesn't have X, Y, or Z characteristic,
Hmm.
right? It's not, suddenly it's not enough to be just a human being, that you have to display some kind of characteristic, that you have to be able to
Hmm.
live on your own per se. Well, we've seen that play out in world history before, where
Hmm.
some human beings are classified as worthy of life, as worthy of protection because of their physical attribute or characteristic, or something that they can't even control, right? It's
Hmm.
not the child's fault. It's not the 8-week old human being's fault that that's just how development works, that
Right.
that 8-week-old human being is dependent on a proper location to survive, that's the reality of it. But
Mm,
as you said, and I really want to capitalize on this point, viability no longer matters when we understand that we're talking about innocent living human beings. It's
mm,
wrong for the same reason that killing any innocent living human being is wrong.
mm. Yeah, those are great. Those are great points. Whenever we deny the personhood, so to speak, of someone we acknowledge as a human being, that's a slippery slope, and that's going to lead to all
Mm-hmm.
sorts of persecution of people based on what they can do, rather, or some characteristic that's arbitrary that they may have, rather than who they are, and the dignity they have as being a member of the human family. All right. Well, I think
Mm-hmm.
let's go from there then, from viability, just to kind of build on this. Let's say that a pro-choice advocate is even willing to grant that this is a life. This is a human life that's in the womb. The argument from bodily autonomy would still trump, again, to use this language, forcing a woman to carry that pregnancy to term. So this is the classic slogan of kind of the pro-choice world of my body, my choice. But maybe to argue it a little bit more strongly, a woman has a right to bodily autonomy. I guess all people have a right to bodily autonomy. She has autonomy over her own body, and nobody can have control over what she chooses to do with her own body. So just to go back to
Mm-hmm.
the kind of the viability and building from there into this argument. So let's say that a pro-choice person is even willing to grant that the life in a womb is just that. It is a human life. It is a human life. That, however, that reality, that fact, doesn't trump the fact that women have a right to bodily autonomy. And even when another life interferes with that bodily autonomy has a primary priority of place, we might say. So, in other words, let's say that abortion is ending a life. Might be an argument. Abortion is ending a life. However, it's ending a non-autonomous life. You don't have the right to autonomy let me say this. If you're a fetus prior to the limit of viability, you do not have autonomy. Therefore, you do not have the right to bodily autonomy. You reside inside of the body of an autonomous person, an autonomous woman. And then the right to bodily autonomy allows the mother to refuse to use her body to support the life of another person. So does that make sense? So that would be another argument from bodily autonomy. It's my body, it's my choice. And you might even say, just to go there, like, even though that is a life, that life is a non-autonomous life. So that life does not have bodily autonomy. Its body does not function on its own. Therefore, it does not have the right to bodily autonomy. And that life cannot get in the way of the bodily autonomy of the mother. So the mother has every right to exercise her own bodily autonomy and end that pregnancy, or in that particular life, we might even say.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to unpack with the term bodily autonomy because
Hmm.
again, we want to be clear in defining our terms and that we're
Right.
not talking apples and oranges. So sometimes this word autonomy is very easily equated with viability. If
Okay.
somebody says, "Well, this human being is not autonomous yet," do they mean that they're not viable yet, right? Or that they're not functioning on their own yet? Because we do know that they are functioning, that
Mm.
they are self-developing from within, that their own body is doing everything proper to function, develop, grow, right? And the only
Right.
thing they need is the nutrients and proper environment. So sometimes those words are used interchangeably. And
Okay.
again, we can go back to what we talked about previously with it doesn't matter whether, this human being is able to, um, live independently of another person, they still have the same worth. But I want to focus on the phrasing "my body, my choice," right?
Okay.
And what people mean by that bodily autonomy argument. Because oftentimes the pro-choice argument for abortion, because of bodily autonomy, actually ends up um, accurately defending the preborn, defending the person within the womb as it does the person outside of the womb. Because if the argument is that, you know, you have the right to your own body, when we just define that the preborn are a living human being with their own body, abortion infringes on the bodily autonomy of that
Hmm.
human being.
Right.
And sometimes they might answer, well, no, it's different. Sure, yes, the preborn human is inside of this woman, then her body is sort of a sovereign domain, a sovereign zone, right? Anything
Hmm.
inside of this woman's body, even if it's another body, well, inherently affects her body too. So I want to clarify, is that what you are asking? Sort of this woman's body is a sovereign zone, therefore she has the right to do whatever she wants within her body, even if that includes another human being?
Yeah, I think maybe a little bit of both. I think maybe people who articulate this position aren't necessarily sure what they mean, but I think they run into.
Right.
I think you can run into problems either way. But I think the first point you said, I do think that's definitely a part of it. The bodily autonomy ought to go both ways. Already establishing that the preborn are human beings, then and their body is functioning exactly as it ought to in that point of development, then they have bodily autonomy. Nobody has a right to go in and intentionally kill that human being, to end their life, to do with their body whatever they will. They're exactly where they ought to be. But I think, yeah, maybe to the other side of it, and this might seem like it has maybe more weight to build from there, is just to say, and I'll use an analogy to kind of like emphasize this in a little bit, but it's just to say that, okay, that is a human life. It is a human being, let's say, but they are infringing upon the bodily autonomy of the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, the mother in that case
Mm-hmm.
does they have certain characteristics, they have certain autonomy that the child, in a different way than that the child in their womb has. So there's a demand being placed on the mother that is unreasonable. And the mother in her bodily autonomy has a certain right to terminate that pregnancy, to not sustain the life. Nobody has a right to do with her body to sustain the life of another body. So even though that would be sadly ending the life of the
Mm-hmm.
preborn, this right to bodily autonomy would trump it in that particular instance.
Right. So my question to you is, does bodily autonomy give us the right to use our body if it's harming another body?
Hmm.
You know, bodily autonomy always has limits.
Right.
It is completely and intimately dependent on me. It's not as though abortion is a mere refusal of my body to that person, right? Abortion is always the active killing of that person. And so, somebody thinks, well, a woman should have the right over her body. Okay. So does that mean that you are okay with the legal option of a woman starving, suctioning, dismembering, or poisoning her child to death, right? Another living human being to
Hmm.
death. I want to make sure that language is clear in their mind. Um, and oftentimes, if they keep persisting on the fact that it's different, this person is inside of the woman's body, I ask them what their thoughts are on taking thalidomide. Have you heard of thalidomide before?
Mm-mm. No.
Okay, so somebody who worldview, the position that anything within my body, within a woman's body, she can control, even if that's another human being's body.
Hmm.
Well, thalidomide is a drug that was used to treat morning sickness. Many doctors would prescribe it. And then come to find out, they realized the severe birth defects that thalidomide was causing. That women who were taking this drug to help with their morning sickness was actually severely deforming the children. And these
Hmm.
children were being born without arms, legs, sometimes both. And so thalidomide was no longer used to treat morning sickness. But if the woman truly had a right to do whatever she wanted inside of her body, because it is her body until that person,
Hmm.
comes out of her body, does she have the right to take thalidomide?
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Well, that's a
you could
absolutely. That's a
even,
go ahead.
well, depending on how you answer, right? Some people will bite the bullet and say,
Mm.
yes, she should have the right to take thalidomide.
Hmm.
Okay, well, what if she wants to take thalidomide to intentionally deform her child?
Mm.
Is she justified in taking thalidomide? Because if her body is truly a sovereign zone, it doesn't matter what she does to anything residing inside of her body,
Right.
even if that means intentionally deforming her own child.
Hmm. To be consistent, a
So,
pro-choice advocate, a pro-abortion advocate would need to say that yes, that's actually fine as well.
mhm,
Hmm.
yeah. And, we know obviously that's that's not allowed.
Hmm.
Thalidomide, you cannot use thalidomide to treat
Yes.
morning sickness because of that. And so it's curious as to why that is wrong, that is outlawed.
Hmm.
Most people will say, no, I don't think she should be able to take thalidomide to intentionally deform her child. Well, why then can she choose to intentionally suction or dismember or starve
Hmm.
her child? All of these forms are forms of violence. And our bodily autonomy has limits. Everybody's bodily autonomy has limits.
Yes.
Bodily autonomy means that your body should be protected from
Yes.
violence, right? From interference from other people. But you cannot use your body to harm an innocent human body. Bodily autonomy
Yes.
doesn't protect you in that. And so
Yes.
you have to ask the question, um, what what is autonomy?
Hmm.
What is bodily autonomy? Because no living human being, despite his or her um, power or position of physical power, has the right to dominate another human being simply because they are smaller or weaker.
Hmm.
Um,
Yes. We'll just use an argument from analogy. Okay. So to build, and I think this has some emotional weight to it. And so let me do the best I can to articulate this argument from analogy to build upon a pro-choice person's case for bodily autonomy. And I think, again, as I said, sometimes this can kind of have an emotional weight to it, especially if you haven't heard it before. So let me try to articulate it, and then you can help us maybe
sure.
respond to it or show some flaws in this particular argument from analogy. So the argument from analogy is to say, and you kind of actually brought this up, a similar example up at the beginning of the episode, so this will be helpful to come back to. Imagine you're driving a car, and as you're driving a car, you cause an accident. And as a result of the accident that you cause, somebody's life is at stake, and they need a kidney to survive. And just it turns out that you are a match to give that person a kidney. And unless you give that person a kidney, they're going to die. Should you be morally or legally or both, should you be morally obligated or legally obligated to give your kidney for that person whose life is in jeopardy because of the accident you caused while driving? Someone might say, how is it different in this case when a kidney is required to save a life or when a uterus, in the case of pregnancy, is required to sustain a life or to grow a life? Two people engage in sex, an accident occurs. As a result of this accident, there's now a human being who needs an organ, the uterus. And without that organ, this human being will die. So the argument then would be, because people have a gut feeling that no, he shouldn't be obligated in the case of that car accident morally or legally to donate the kidney. And so if the parallels are even, then you might think, oh, okay, well then how is it different? Why would a mother be obligated to give her uterus to sustain the life of the baby that now exists as a result of this action, sex?
Right. So the parallels are different. As I mentioned earlier, you can choose to give the kidney to this person. You can choose to not give your kidney.
Hmm.
But are you able to choose to kill them? You know, this person that you've now tragically hit your car with, right, who's in need of a kidney, I do not think you have the legal or maybe even not the moral obligation to give your kidney to this person. At the very least, I don't think you have the legal obligation.
Mm-hmm.
I also don't think you have the legal right to stab this person,
Yes.
to physically dismember this person, or to poison this person. If we
Yes.
truly wanted to make the scenarios equal, if we truly wanted to show what an abortion was like, it wouldn't just be that this woman is denying her uterus, right? Because the child is already there. It's not as though
Yes.
abortion is a preemptive measure, right? It's that there is already a child. And the only choice we think should not be legal is the choice to kill. And so to put it in a different analogy, there's so many analogies whenever we're talking about pregnancy and abortion. But another analogy would be, let's say that you have a boat, right? And you take off from dock and you're miles into the sea, and you discover that a 2-year-old has wandered onto your boat, that the 2-year-old was hiding inside your boat and they've been there the whole time, right? Your options could be either to help this 2-year-old safely get back to shore, right? Or hypothetically, because the 2-year-old is what would be the right word? An intruder to your boat, and you have the right to your boat and the right to property over your boat, you can choose to throw the 2-year-old overboard, right? But nobody would say you're justified in violently throwing this 2-year-old into the sea where you know this 2-year-old is going to die. Even though your right to property, your right to your boat, right, exists, I don't think you therefore have the legal option to throw an innocent child overboard. And
Yeah.
so when we're dealing with abortion, have that second scenario of just refusing, of just not giving
Mm.
your kidney or not giving your uterus, because your child's already in the uterus, just like that child
Yeah.
was already on the boat. And so you can either choose to give that child the basic nutrients and shelter they need to get back to shore, right? To exit the
Yes.
womb and surrender your parental rights to somebody else, or you can choose to kill that child. That's really what we're talking about. Um, so you ask that person, okay, maybe they don't have the right, they don't have the legal, duty to give their kidney. Does that mean therefore they can just stab the person to death? I would say no.
No, that was so helpful, Mary Carmen. I think that was a great, it was a great articulation of why this analogy doesn't make any sense. I love how you emphasize like there are actually different options, even regardless of the analogy. Giving somebody a kidney, you can either give them the kidney, you can not give them the kidney, or you can go and actually just go murder them, kill them. And
Right.
I feel like that's what's so obviously missing in this analogy. In the case of pregnancy, the option are either to, as you said, the child is already in the uterus is for them, they're already there. The option is to sustain life, and they're exactly where they're supposed to be, or to kill the
Right.
life. And that's not the case in the case. I would say even morally, it would be heroic to give that person a kidney, but you're not morally even obligated to do so. You certainly can choose to do so heroically, but you're not morally obligated in the same way. You can not give them your kidney, and as a result, that person might die, even if that's not your intention to do so, of course. That's
Right.
entirely different than actually going and killing them or ripping out their other kidney so that they die, with that being the
Exactly.
intention. And I think so that's a really significant morally relevant difference in the parallels. For a argument from analogy to work, of course, the parallels actually have to actually be parallel. I think what's so interesting
Hmm.
about maybe some of these, even let's say the best pro-choice arguments for abortion, is that you have to come up with these like weird analogies or stories to make abortion start to kind of make sense or have some kind of emotional weight.
Right.
And even then, I think obviously you can tear apart the argument as you've done very well. Where the pro-life argument, honestly, is so simple. Obviously, a child could articulate it. It's always gravely immoral. It's always wrong to directly and intentionally kill the life of another human being because they have dignity as the fact that they're part of the human race. They're part of the human family. Mm-hmm. And so I think like an analogy like this car accident analogy, I can see why it could trip you up, and I can see why it could be a little bit confusing or have some kind of an emotional pull to it. But again, the parallels are not parallel in morally significant ways. And also, it just seems so interesting that for abortion to even begin to make sense, you have to start to come up with these imagined scenarios that are never happening.
Right. And all of the scenarios conveniently forget or, intentionally don't state that third option, which is really, right, killing that person through starvation, suction, dismemberment, or poison. So you have to, any analogy, any conversation you have about abortion, you need to ask the question, what are the preborn and what is abortion? If you can answer those questions, you are able to successfully, in every conversation, prove why abortion is always a moral wrong, right? If you can define who the preborn are, a living human being, a member of our species, innocent, and what abortion through starvation, suction, dismemberment, or poison, well, then no scenario justifies that for the same reason that intentionally starving, suction, dismembering, or poisoning any other living human being is never justified.
I think if just to kind of put a nail on this analogy as well, I would encourage people to go look up. There's actually an example of this argument. If you type in red pen logic abortion, I think one of the most recent videos. It's a great YouTube channel. He responds to a good articulation of this argument from analogy using this car accident. And he shared a lot of the same things that you're sharing, Mary Carmen, as well. So I encourage people to go listen to that. But he kind of says that there's 4 significant morally relevant differences between this analogy and abortion, this car accident situation and abortion. I'll briefly share these 4, and then I'm curious your thoughts, Mary Carmen, and then we can have some closing thoughts. But he says first, driving a car, and you mentioned this to me before we started recording, actually, but driving a car is not ordered towards sustaining someone else's life with your organ. Really clearly. That can happen, I guess, in that crazy scenario. But driving a car is not naturally ordered toward that. That is an accident. Whereas sex is ordered towards life. If you engage in sex and then you're pregnant, that's not an accident, strictly speaking. That is the only way that pregnancy can occur.
It's the byproduct. That's the product of sex, right?
Right. And so that's one. Number 2 is giving someone else your kidney is an unnatural use of body parts, where you've articulated so well. The uterus is actually for gestating the life of a preborn baby. That's actually its purpose. Your kidney's purpose is not to be given to the person who's injured because of the car accident.
Right.
Of course, you can choose to do that heroically, but your kidney belongs for your body, actually. A uterus, actually, only purpose, it doesn't serve a purpose for your body. The purpose is for the life of the child. And so that's a pretty significant difference. Number 3 is that the analogy tries to equate the relationship between strangers with the relationship between a mother and her child. Surely a mother has more responsibility to her child than she does for a random stranger. And then finally, there's a more, as you said, this is like, I think, the main point. There's an extremely morally relevant difference and distinction, a difference between refusing to help, refusing to offer a kidney, so to speak, and intentionally and directly killing, which is what happens in abortion. An abortion isn't just refusing to help sustain the life of the child. It's going in there and intentionally and directly killing the life of that child.
Right. Yeah. Those first 3 were always the ones that I would bring up or use whenever it was a violinist analogy or even just this car analogy. And and I think they can be helpful in just kind of pointing out the obvious differences. I think the fourth one is the strongest
Yes.
to really hone in on, because even though, as you mentioned, and absolutely, right, there's a difference in relationship between strangers and a mother and a child, right?
Yes.
A parent is obligated to provide for their child, right? If the child is found neglected or severely malnourished, well, that parent is now charged with child neglect or child
Mm.
abuse, right? Why? How? Because parents have an obligation to feed their children, right? Or if that child is, a newborn baby and is found outside in the blizzard and in the cold, well, that parent is now charged with child abandonment. Why? Because parents have an obligation to, protect their children in basic scenarios, right? But something that you know a something that a pro-abortion advocate could respond to is that, okay, well, even so, if let's say this was the parent that got in a car accident and hit their child,
Hmm.
and their child is now in need of a kidney donation, you still, maybe that parent has a higher moral duty
Hmm.
to give the kidney to their child, but you can't legally force the parent to give
Hmm.
the kidney to the child. And so sometimes they'll try to respond
Yeah.
with that, which is,
Interesting.
pretty credible to some extent, right? Um, but that's why it's important to remember that fourth point is that
Hmm.
refusing your kidney is not the same thing as actively killing a child who's in utero. Those are
Yes.
different, um, because it's not as though, you know, the uterus wasn't given first to the child, it's that the child's already in the uterus, right?
Yes.
And you'd have to actively
Yes.
kill the child to remove the child. Um, or you can carry that child to term. So I always think the
Hmm.
fourth point is the strongest, particularly when dealing when conversing with people who don't believe that there's any design to the universe or design to
Yes.
our bodies. You know, I actually had a conversation with a student at IU who, when I brought up, well, the uterus was designed for somebody else, and he questioned me on that. He said, "Designed, you know, uh, um, designed by who?" Because he didn't believe in God.
Hmm.
So even though it is just a mere reality that the uterus is the
Yeah.
organ
Even
intended for another
from
person,
yeah, even from a nearly naturalistic explanation,
yeah,
it's clear if you study the body, that's what it's for. Whether or not you're a
right,
religious person and attribute that to God.
exactly,
Yeah.
right, yeah. So all are great ways to just kind of show that the parallels are not exact, that they're not similar. So thank you
Mm.
for reminding the audience of those.
Hmm. Mary Carmen, I really appreciate everything you shared so far. I think you offered people great things to think about, and for people who are pro-life, great tools for them to engage in conversation with people in their lives about this question. Is there any final things you'd like to say before we close the episode?
Um, I would just encourage everybody. I would urge everybody to not be silent anymore.
Hmm.
Whether it's you're a student and your professor brings up casually abortion, or somebody in class brings up abortion and they kind of laugh it off. It is so easy to remain silent and to not open the tension. I mean, the tension's already there, right? But
Yeah.
I cannot tell you how many times, even myself, like when I was a student, just having that fear, my heart's beating a million times a minute because I know that if I speak my mind about abortion, I'm alone. I'm the only one in my class or the only one, in my
Hmm.
circle of friends who feels that way. And so that that really silences people, right? The pro-abortion um, narrative is really good at kind of silencing pro-lifers from speaking truth and even just having the conversation, right? So I just urge everybody who's listening to this, if you've been looking for a sign to finally have that tough conversation with a family member or a friend or a relative, a child, have that conversation, right?
Hmm.
By being silent, you are actually preventing women, and fathers, young fathers, of children in the womb, from the guidance they need to make informed decisions about abortion, to educate others about abortion. So never fear of just talking about abortion, because as you mentioned, it's pretty simple, right? That every human being, regardless of how old they are, regardless of how dependent or autonomous they are, is still a biological living human being, right?
Mm.
And the argument from equality is that every human being
Yes.
is equal and therefore deserves the same protection from violence. So,
Yes, well, thanks so much, Mary Carmen. Everybody, thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful for you. Remember the words of Jesus: blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That was standing out to me as you were sharing that, Mary Carmen. Being willing to speak the truth in love. If you are persecuted for the sake of standing up for the rights of innocent preborn human beings, then you are close to the Lord in that, and know that He is with you even in the midst of that persecution. And so, I would just reiterate what Mary Carmen said: being willing to have these conversations even when they're uncomfortable. Know that the Lord is with you as you go. Hopefully listening to things like this is helpful for you to navigate these conversations that can be difficult at times, and to be a voice for the unborn. Mary Carmen, thanks so much for joining. It's been great to have you.
thank you so much, Sean. Pleasure.
All right, everybody, have a great day, and God bless.